My name is Asanta, and I am 22 years old. I just graduated from college, and now I want to tell you a story about my home. Technically, it was my mother's house. Or, more precisely, it belonged to her until she passed away from colon cancer 4 years ago and left it to me. My mother was always the one who planned everything, always looking ahead, organizing every aspect of our lives like an experienced architect who knows exactly what each brick in the foundation should be. Even when she was diagnosed, she continued to believe that everything would be okay. At first, she worried about her treatment, and later, about me being able to continue living in this house when she wouldn't be around anymore. This house was hers, and perhaps even part of her. She bought it before she met my father. Thank God, she managed to do that. It was her solid foundation, the place where you could always feel safe, despite all the changes life brought. For her peace of mind, she made sure I knew about it. The will was arranged in such a way that I wouldn't have to worry about the future. "This house will be yours," she told me, her voice steadied despite everything she had been through. When I was a little girl, my days with my mother seemed predictable, peaceful, and safe. However, things were not always that easy. My father, with whom she had been married for 10 years, one day decided to leave us. I was 9 years old when he simply packed his things and left. There were no dramas, no arguments or legal battles, as often happens in such situations. He didn't argue about who would take care of me, didn't try to divide the property, he just left. The only thing he agreed to was to pay for my education by opening a special account and transferring the entire amount for my future studies. I never understood exactly what he meant by that, but I think it was his version of alimony. My father quickly created a new family. His new wife, Deborah, gave birth to a daughter who was 10 years younger than me. Sometimes I visited them, staying in their rented house, but it never felt right. I always felt like an outsider, although I tried not to show it. Deborah was busy with her daughter, constantly listing her latest accomplishments or doing her hair. My father was at work, claiming that he needed to support the family. And I stayed on the sidelines, trying not to get in the way. "Asanta, would you like to join us for dinner?" Deborah would ask, and I always knew by her tone that she hoped I would decline. We maintained polite but awkward relations, exchanging greeting cards and holiday wishes. Sometimes there were forced family dinners, full of tension that made the skin crawl. Everything was very proper, but in the sense that we were not close. My mother earned well working as a senior accountant, so when she was diagnosed, she was able to focus on her treatment. I was 14 when we were told she was ill, and she immediately quit her job to devote herself to fighting the disease. For 4 years, we lived between hospital visits and treatment sessions. My mother never complained. She didn't talk about her fears, didn't show any weakness. Instead, she continued to fight and plan, take care of me, and stay confident that everything would be okay. But cancer doesn't care about plans. I was 18 when she passed. She died just a few weeks before I was supposed to leave for college in another state. The loss was so heavy that I could barely function. At the moment when I felt like the world around me was falling apart, my father, who had never been an example of care, suddenly stepped up. He suggested that Deborah and my half-sister move in with me temporarily to support me during this difficult time. I was too numb to doubt this, and too grateful for any help they could offer. "We'll help you get through this," my father said, hugging me around the shoulders. Deborah nodded, trying to look sympathetic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this care wasn't sincere. My half-sister, in the meantime, shamelessly explored what was now my house, as if she had the right to inspect everything and take what she needed. By the end of the summer, I faced a dilemma. In a few weeks, college would start, and I had no idea what to do with my mother's house. It was the house where my entire childhood had passed, a house that was part of me, but I couldn't leave it empty for 4 years. Selling it also seemed impossible. The thought of getting rid of this place caused me pain. And that's when, one morning at breakfast, my father came up with a solution. "Asanta," he said, pushing his coffee cup aside, "I was thinking, what if we stay here? We'll pay all the bills, maintain the place, and you won't have to worry about anything while you're in school." I looked at Deborah, who was making pancakes on the stove. She turned and smiled when she noticed I was watching her. "It would be good for all of us," she added, as if emphasizing that the decision to stay here was not just mine, but theirs as well. Sophie was already enrolled in the local school, and the house would be well taken care of. These words were said with such confidence that, despite all my doubts, I felt the tension slowly easing. It made sense, and after they moved in with me, things went surprisingly well for the next 2 months. Deborah, with whom I had once barely managed to communicate, became much more open. Her distance melted away like morning fog when the sun begins to shine brighter. She was no longer the woman who secretly watched me from behind a raised teacup, holding back a smile to not show her strange kindness. She sincerely took an interest in what was going on in my life, and sometimes we discussed everyday matters, which seemed unnecessary but actually helped us get closer. Sophie, my half-sister, quickly began to treat me like a real sister rather than a stranger who occasionally showed up in their house. She began to share her worries, her problems at school, and I, in turn, listened with interest, trying to help as best as I could. Looking back, it all seemed like the perfect solution. I packed up my mother's personal belongings, keeping only those things that truly meant something to me. Everything else I hid in the attic, things that were invisible to everyone but were so important to me, holding memories of my mother, like old photographs, letters, and recollections. I left for college without any doubts about my decision. Over the 4 years that I studied, I only came home during the holidays and summer breaks. These visits were pleasant and warm, more like Sunday dinners, where the family gathers around the table despite all the differences. Deborah gladly cooked dinners, setting a plentiful table as soon as I came home. "I made your favorite lasagna," she would say, although I always thought she didn't know my food preferences, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how eager she was to show care and attention. Sophie, in turn, would drag me to her room to show me her latest projects or tell me about some school drama, which always seemed so funny and endearing. At Christmas, we all decorated the tree together. Dad lifted Sophie up so she could place the star on top, and Deborah and I cheerfully argued about what was better, the latest New Year's trend or the classic style. Dad seemed completely uninterested in these disagreements, but he was there, and that was important. We sat, drank hot chocolate, and sometimes I almost forgot that this family was nothing like the one I had started my life with. We were becoming closer, creating a new kind of relationship that was foreign to all my previous ideas of what a normal family looked like. Summer visits were even more relaxed. Sophie and I spent the days at the public pool, discussing books, which I helped her with by reading chapters aloud and explaining confusing parts. Deborah invited me to her book club meetings, and we had a great time dissecting the romance novels on the agenda for the month. I was surprised at how easily I had come to connect with them, even though just a few years ago, I couldn't have imagined becoming part of this life. I noticed that Deborah often spoke to Dad about how great it was that I had come home, how wonderful it was that Sophie and I had become close. It warmed me, as if I had really become part of something that could be called a family. Phone calls home became regular, with Dad and I discussing my classes and college progress, and Deborah keeping me updated on how things were going at home. "The roses you planted are blooming beautifully," she would say, showing that she really cared about what mattered to me. And Sophie would tell me about her first day of middle school, and even though it all seemed so mundane, there was something warm and sincere in these conversations. We were creating a strange yet functional family, growing on the foundation of my mother's house. And I never thought it could be possible, combining 2 worlds, 2 completely different parts of my life into one picture. But everything seemed to be falling into place surprisingly well. Until it all came crashing down. Finally, at 22, after receiving my diploma and with a job lined up, I was ready to begin a new chapter of my life. I accepted a job offer from Marshall and Brooks Financial in my hometown. I had interviewed with them via Zoom, and they immediately offered me the position. It seemed like the perfect turn of events, and everything was falling into place just as I had hoped. I was going home to start this new phase, but behind me, the house remained, the house my mother had left, which now symbolized not just the past but also my present. The taxi dropped me off in front of my house. It was a sunny June midday, I stood there for a moment, admiring the familiar view, which seemed both close and strange. My mother's rose bushes were in full bloom, although they now looked different, not as lush and neat as they had when she tended to them. They were the same bushes, but showing signs of time. The flowers seemed paler, the leaves slightly wilted, and the fragrance wasn't as strong as before. It was as if invisible changes had been made to the house and the garden, as if someone had been updating them, but not with the same love my mother had put into them. The lawn was neatly trimmed, and new curtains hung in the windows, changes, too, but ones that only added to the sense of unfamiliarity, as if the house was now following someone else's rules. I reached into my pocket and took out the keys. Smiling, with some inexplicable sense of satisfaction, I headed toward the front door, already imagining how I would sleep in my old room that night. It would be warm and peaceful, I thought, adjusting the suitcase on my shoulder. Expectations had always been so simple, but they never turned out the way we picture them. When I reached the door and tried to insert the key into the lock, it seemed like something was wrong. I tried again, thinking maybe I was just tired from the journey, but the lock wouldn't turn. My fingers trembled slightly as I tried to make it give, but the key didn't fit. What the hell? I muttered, feeling something inside me tense up, as if someone had taken the familiar control out of my hands. I stood there, stunned, for a few seconds, then gave up and knocked loudly on the door. Noon, an ideal time for everyone to be home, relaxing and watching TV. I waited for a response, not understanding what was happening, and not immediately sensing how uneasy my inner world had become. Deborah opened the door. Her eyes widened in surprise. She was wearing an apron, with traces of flour on her hands. She looked like she had just been absorbed in some household chore, and this image didn't at all match what I had expected. Asanta, what are you doing here? Her voice was almost as soft and soothing as it had been back in the old days when she tried to impress me with her friendliness. I rolled my suitcase into the hallway, noticing that Dad and Sophie were sitting in the living room. They both looked equally surprised by my appearance. Sophie was lounging on the couch with her phone, and Dad was sitting in the old armchair that had once belonged to Mom, reading something on his tablet. What do you mean? I live here, I said, feeling irritation begin to rise within me. I glanced around at the changes in the interior, which seemed small but stood out so much in the context of my return. Why were the locks changed? I asked, not hiding my displeasure. My voice sounded colder than ever. Dad suddenly turned toward me, his fingers barely brushing his neck, an old habit I remembered from childhood whenever he was nervous. Oh, yes, I changed them last month, he said, avoiding my gaze, for security reasons. You know, there have been a few break-ins in the neighborhood. You could have told me, I said, trying to hide my irritation. Or sent me a new key. I mean, this is my house, Dad. Deborah, her arms crossed over her chest, looked even more awkward than usual. She was wiping flour off her hands, but it was clear she saw the whole scene unfolding as something bigger than just a forgotten key. We weren't expecting you, she said cautiously, as though justifying herself. Why not? I replied, feeling resentment bubbling up in my chest. I finished my studies last week. I told you I was coming back home to start my new job. I even called. I looked between them, sensing the discomfort in the air. Something was off with their reactions. Sophie even put her phone down and watched the scene intently, as though she knew something important that I didn't understand. Dad suddenly stood up, shifting his chair. His face grew serious, and he seemed to be struggling to say something important. Can we talk in the office? He said, and I felt how his words took over, swallowing my inner world. I nodded, and without saying a word, followed him into Mom's old office, which was now mine. It was the room where Mom's diplomas hung on the wall, where a collection of financial manuals sat on the shelves, but everything felt alien, as though these objects didn't belong to me. Dad closed the door behind us, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. He turned to face me, his gaze still avoiding and troubled. Listen, sweetheart, he began quietly, with some effort, you need to know something. He paused for a second, as though searching for the right words, and then continued. Deborah, she thinks this house belongs to her. I froze, not understanding what he meant. He went on, not meeting my eyes. I gave it to your mother and you out of goodwill, after the divorce, and after your mom died, it came to me. As she thinks. I'm just living here because I allowed it. I stared at my father, unable to believe my ears. It felt like I stood there, motionless, for a full minute before I found my voice again. I sat at the kitchen table, fiddling with the mug of cold coffee, feeling the tension between me and Deborah gradually building up. The evening after dinner felt like an eclipse, full of awkwardness and hidden irritation. With every look she threw my way, with every barely noticeable gesture, it was as though she was trying to push me away, make me feel alien and unnecessary. I could have called it just typical female jealousy, but it was something more. Deborah didn't just reject me, she started sinking her claws into every corner of my existence, beginning with the most familiar and harmless things. Her cold words in the morning were the last straw. As if nothing had changed, as though I hadn't come home after several years of studying, as if I weren't a part of this family. Being in her house, I felt like an outsider, a spectator who wasn't allowed to step into the role of the main character. When do you plan to find your own place? It hit me like a punch to the stomach, a question that stunned me and at the same time stripped me of the last illusions that I had been welcomed back with joy. But isn't this my house? Don't I have the right to stay? My mind swung between anger and confusion, but deep down I knew Deborah wouldn't back down. With every passing day, her actions became more open and less veiled. Every time she moved something in the house, I felt as though she was quietly pulling the memory of Mom from every corner. Vases, photographs, books on the shelves, everything was rearranged, as if she wanted to erase the past, especially me. The next morning, after she had slowly left for her errands, I couldn't sit still any longer. I knew I had to talk to Dad, but how? He was my father, but now he felt like a stranger to me. I could feel he had changed, that he wasn't the man I remembered. All of it seemed unreal. His face when he handed me the new keys, his desperate attempts to persuade me to give him time, his words that everything would be resolved if I just waited. But I knew that time was important to me. All I wanted was to go back to my life, but that wasn't possible. When I returned to the bedroom, I found that the bed had been moved into the corner, and on the pillow lay a small note in Deborah's harsh handwriting. I hope you don't mind the changes. This will be more convenient. I clenched my fists and read the note again, trying to control the anger bubbling inside me. Every action of hers was a provocation. I could no longer sit idly by, and I had no choice but to act. I couldn't believe I was still in this house, living by their rules, following their laws. But every day it became more obvious, I couldn't just be a bystander. That evening was the last time I allowed myself to quietly endure. I made a decision. I had to find a way out, find my own path. After dinner, when Deborah silently went off to the kitchen again, I sat down and wrote a letter to my father. It was necessary, so I wouldn't have to say out loud what I had been keeping inside for so long. Dad, you know I can't stay in this situation. I appreciate everything you've done, but I have to go my own way. I can't wait for you to find us a new place. I need to act on my own. I put the letter in an envelope and placed it on his favorite armchair. When he came home, I would be ready to talk to him. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but one thing was clear. I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't be part of this false family idol. I was ready to start a new life, and if I had to leave, I would. The next morning, when I left my room, I noticed that Dad was sitting on the couch, engrossed in his tablet, and Deborah was standing by the window, as if she didn't even notice me. Sophie was sitting in the corner, still staring at her phone. But when I walked into the kitchen, she unexpectedly put the phone down, glanced at me, and said, "Are you leaving?" That question hit me deep, and I knew there was no way out. I had to make a choice, either stay and suffer, or leave and start over. I walked past them without answering and quietly went to the door. I could no longer allow myself to be part of this fake family. My footsteps echoed in the empty house. The complete silence felt both agonizing and unsettling. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened. It was as though the world around me had frozen, completely empty, devoid of the life and noise that had always accompanied it. A few months ago, this kitchen had been full of sounds, smells, movements. Life had constantly bubbled here, the clatter of pans, conversations, Deborah with her endless notes and meal preparations, her unwavering concern for every detail. Even Sophie, always in her corner, was stirring up yet another storm of emotions in her phone calls with friends or new guys. But now, silence. Suddenly, I felt a chill that pierced me to the bone. A strange sensation, as if not only everything living had disappeared from the house, but its very soul as well, leaving a void that consumed me whole. I walked further down the hallway, noticing the absence of familiar traces of life. No shoes by the door, no Sophie's toys scattered around, no glass with leftover water on the table left by Dad after breakfast. I entered the living room and froze. There was no TV, no Dad sitting by the screen, arms crossed and tapping his foot in anticipation of the next sports match. The furniture was strangely arranged, as if someone had hastily moved things around, but there was no ease, no comfort. Everything seemed foreign, cold, as though this wasn't a home, but just a place where people lived without feeling any connection to their surroundings. Only questions spun in my head. Where were they all? Why weren't they here? No notes, no explanations. I even checked my phone, but found no messages, no calls. This was strange and made me uneasy. I had never seen the house like this, abandoned, as if it had become the stage of some movie, where all the characters had vanished, leaving the main character alone. Rummaging through the pockets of my jeans, I pulled out my keys and tried to find some clue. And then, as I passed by the closet in the hallway, something caught my attention, a small box on the top shelf. I approached it, took it in my hands, and felt my heart beat faster. Inside the box was a photograph, old and slightly faded, showing the family, Dad, Mom, and me, when I was very little. We were all happy, sitting at the table, holding festive glasses, with the bright summer sun shining through the window. This photograph felt like the last memory of the time when we were whole, when I could believe that this was a real family, not just a random combination of people thrown together in this house. My fingers slid along the edges of the photo, and then I noticed something strange. On the back was a date and a few words. If only you knew how much we all love you. These words, so simple yet so full of hidden meaning, made me feel a deep emptiness. Who wrote this? Why was it hidden from me? I didn't know, but one thing became clear. Everything I had been through recently was some kind of nightmare for which I hadn't received any explanations or answers. It seemed like I was losing touch with reality. Why had everyone suddenly disappeared? Why hadn't they told me? Why had they left me alone in this house, in this cold, soulless space, where every chair and every vase felt foreign to me? I checked my phone again. No messages. I walked from room to room, from one door to another, but the house remained empty, and all I could do was ask myself endless questions with no answers. I decided to go outside. Maybe they had just gone somewhere, and I should wait. But there were no car tracks on the driveway. The thudding in my chest grew louder. This couldn't be a coincidence. The whole day had been too strange, and the more I tried to understand, the deeper I sank into the fog of uncertainty. For a moment, I thought maybe all of this was part of some plan. Perhaps they had disappeared to arrange a surprise, to show me that everything would be as it was before. But the more I thought about it, the more unlikely that scenario seemed. No, it wasn't like that. It couldn't be. They couldn't just vanish without any explanation, without at least some attempt to contact me. And then I realized I needed to act. I needed to find them. I had to get answers. I couldn't just sit here, lost in guesses, not knowing what was going on. I had to take responsibility for my life and for what was happening in this house. I took a deep breath and decided to step outside, not knowing where this path would lead me, but knowing one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in this dead house. I sat in the kitchen, frozen by an inner cold, yet at the same time filled with the storm they had just unleashed in my face. Deborah's voice, full of hatred and contempt, echoed in my mind, not letting me go for a long time. I tried to understand what had just happened, how they could do this to me, how they could throw me out of my own home as if I were just a burden. But perhaps this was exactly what I deserved. For so long, I had remained here like a silent shadow, not intervening, not changing, content with what was offered to me. I had no right to ask questions, to demand more, and the moment I realized that I had been nothing more than part of their game all this time, I felt something snap inside me. Anger came with renewed force, taking over completely. I jumped to my feet, unaware of what I was doing, and began rummaging through the cupboards, pulling out their things with incredible brutality, as if each item were part of their sham bed, the one where, as they had decided, I was supposed to stay forever. Dad's golf clubs, his pride, what he called a real man's possession. Sophie's school supplies, which, as I had always thought, she desperately scattered in search of her place in this house. Deborah, the woman who always seemed a step ahead of me, with her attire, manners, and confidence, who was now gone, leaving only bitter memories. I threw the items into boxes with such force that it felt like I was taking revenge on them. I wasn't just packing them up, I was venting everything that had built up over the years, in which they made me feel like an outsider. I could feel the air around me thickening and growing heavy. The room was filled with tense silence, in which every note of their false words sounded like the final chord of their deception. And then I understood, I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't stay in this house, full of lies, where every room had become a prison for my feelings, where every corner was soaked with hatred, though masked as care and good intentions. I had to get out, to break free and start my life anew, truly. I could perhaps hope for the best, believe they would change their minds and come back one day, but deep down I knew that wouldn't happen. Blocking their numbers, I felt an icy emptiness in my heart. I was alone. Without Dad, without Deborah, without their promises and my dreams of a normal life. All that remained was this cold house and the boxes of strangers' belongings I had so hastily packed. I didn't feel pity, but I felt desperate pain. The pain of realizing that I had tried for so long to be part of their lives, only to understand at some point that I was just an addition, an unnecessary element that could be discarded. My hands continued to shake, but no longer from fear. This was anger, crashing over me like a waterfall that destroys everything in its path. I was no longer going to be a passive observer of their lives, their drama. I was no longer going to sit in the corner and accept their decisions, their views. Suddenly, I felt my throat dry up. All these boxes, these things, these items, they reminded me of something important, but elusive. They were not just things, they had become symbols of what I had ignored for so long, that my life had been in the hands of others, that I was just part of someone else's world, someone else's plan. And now, as everything was collapsing, as I started to understand that none of this mattered, I couldn't stay here. There was no place for me here. I forced myself to take a step. First one, then another. I walked to the door, then to my things left in the cupboards, and with determination, I began to gather everything I needed. All these years, I had worn the mask of a daughter, a sister, a submissive woman who was supposed to always stay in the background, in the shadows of others. But now I no longer needed to hide. I was leaving behind this house, this family that couldn't understand me. I stepped outside and felt the cold air on my face, as if the world around me was finally becoming clear and honest. At that moment, I realized I was meant to be here, outside, beyond their walls, beyond their attachments and false promises. My journey was just beginning. I sat in the car, looking at their suitcases next to the rented car, unable to understand what had happened. Their faces, twisted with irritation and hostility, caused neither pain nor pity. I had allowed myself to be part of their world, their lies, for far too long. Their words, full of accusations and rage, left no room for doubt. I wasn't going to give up. They thought they could come back and take everything as before, but I was no longer the Asanta who would accept their crumbs and pretend everything was fine. No, now I was ready to defend my home, my place in this world, my boundaries. When I stepped out of the car, their shouts, full of anger and indignation, barely touched me. I felt only a strange emptiness beginning to fill all my thoughts. Deborah, always ready for arguments and manipulations, her voice piercing the silence, but inside me, there was no longer that feeling of fear that had once been there. This wasn't just liberation, it was a true sense of power over my own destiny. I wasn't going to back down. "How dare you change our locks?" she yelled, continuing to approach me like a wild animal, stopping for nothing. I looked at her, and this time my words were firm and calm, as though I had been preparing for this moment for a long time. "This is not your house, Deborah," I said, stepping toward the door. "It never belonged to you. This house belongs to me. My mother bought it, and she left it to me in her will. The only reason you've been living here is because I allowed you to. Temporarily." I noticed how her face, which had just shown rage, instantly shifted. She seemed to shrink, like a snake sensing danger. She turned to look at my father, and his gaze, full of helplessness and fear, met mine. He didn't know how to react, didn't know what to say, and just shrugged, as if he were no longer part of the scene. "She's telling the truth," he said, slumping, his voice hoarse and weak. "The house has always belonged to her." It was only then that I noticed how her hands began to tremble. I watched her standing in front of me, mouth open, unable to believe her ears. The truth was bitter for her, and I felt her strength leaving her, as if she were losing control of the situation, of this entire world she had tried so hard to control. She laughed, but the laugh was not sincere. It sounded like a nervous croak, an attempt to hide the anxiety that was taking over her mind. "Oh, Asanta, darling," she said, choking on her laughter. "Didn't you think I was joking? You know how emotional I can be. This sun, these tropical cocktails. Sometimes they confuse me." But I wasn't fooled by her words. I could no longer allow myself to believe her lies. I took a step forward, my voice quiet but full of determination. "Stop it," I said, not raising my voice, but so confidently that she didn't dare continue. She stopped, but her gaze was filled with contempt and judgment, as if she still couldn't believe that I wasn't falling for her manipulation. She wanted me to believe in her caring mother mask, but I had long seen her true face. "We're family," she continued, but this time her words sounded as if she were forcing them out. "Remember how we started? The book club, the festive dinners. We can bring it all back. You know we've always been there for you." She took a step toward me, extending her hands, as if trying to come close, as if I might suddenly believe she still wanted to hug me, kiss me. But I didn't move. I stood like a stone wall, not allowing her manipulations to penetrate my heart. And it was at that moment that I heard his voice. "Dad." His voice was trembling, almost indistinct, but full of desperation. "Princess," he said, his words seeming sincere, but I couldn't forget everything that had happened. "I'm so sorry. I know I was wrong. I made a mistake. But I love you. You're my daughter. Please, don't go. We'll figure everything out." I froze. I looked at him, this man who had been there with me, but at the same time, was so far away. I remembered how he had left me when I was 9. I remembered how he continued to pay for my education but never cared about how I lived, what I needed. I remembered how he stood by Deborah when she made her plans, how they both decided to get rid of me, how they planned to throw me out of the house. I stood in front of him, watching how his face changed. I didn't see love there. I only saw self-pity and fear that I might finally break free from him. "No," I said quietly but firmly. "You didn't love me, Dad. You only loved yourself and your comfort. You lied to her, lied to me, and you never cared about me. Tell me, did you really think I would stay here when you, just like Deborah, decided to play your games? Now you want me to forgive everything? Everything I've been through?" I looked at him, and in that moment, everything in my body froze, as if I had just made the most important decision. Deborah turned to me with that same smile she often used when she tried to hide her true nature, that smile that seemed kind and sincere, but in the depths of her eyes lurked a refined manipulation. She knew how to play on my weaknesses, how to invoke guilt if the situation required it. But now, I was different. Now, I saw right through her. Asanta, let's be reasonable, she said, stepping toward me confidently, as though everything had already been decided. We can all live here together, share the space. We'll pay rent. I looked at her calmly, as though this sentence was just part of the empty game she was trying to play. She thought I would give in again. But I was no longer the one who feared losing her attention or approval. No, I replied firmly, looking her in the eyes. We can live separate lives. Your things are in the garage, take them and leave. And at that moment, Deborah's mask cracked again. Everything about her behavior, everything she had tried to build, crumbled when she didn't get the expected response. Her face, once confident and arrogant, twisted, and a spiteful whisper appeared on her lips. You ungrateful little, __, she spat, not hiding her anger. After everything we've done for you, you're ready to throw your own family out on the street? I didn't feel the slightest bit of anxiety. Her words, full of fury and resentment, didn't touch me. I felt a strange calm, as if everything happening was inevitable. You just spent $10,000 on a luxurious vacation that you deliberately hid from me, I replied, not looking away. I'm pretty sure you can afford an apartment. My words caught her off guard. She fell silent, and for a moment, her eyes clouded. I knew that this wasn't just about seeing me as the rebellious daughter anymore. She was starting to realize that I no longer fell for her manipulations. Dad tried to grab my hand again, his voice trembling with tension. Asanta, please, he pleaded. I know I messed up, but we can fix everything. I cut him off. You didn't mess up, I said, not raising my voice. You lied to me for 4 years. You let your wife believe that she owned my mother's house. You stood by her while she tried to erase all traces of Mom from my house. You watched as she planned to kick me out and didn't say a word. You never defended me. I saw his face pale. He realized that I wasn't going to give in. But his words, those pitiful attempts to justify himself, meant nothing to me. Everything I had once thought of him as a family member burned away in the fire of truth, and I knew I could never go back. I was going to tell her the truth, he mumbled, but I didn't let him finish. You're too late. You've been silent all this time. You were an accomplice in her lies, I said, feeling my anger calm. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was simply about liberation. I turned and walked into the house, leaving them behind. I closed the door, ignoring Deborah's screams that came through the window, desperate and futile attempts to pull me back into their world of lies. I watched as they loaded boxes from the garage into their rented car. Deborah kept shouting, her face red with fury, while Sophie cried, and Dad stood hunched, defeated and silent. It took them 3 trips to get all their things. The last box was carried out, and when they were almost done, Dad tried once again to knock on the door. But I didn't open it. I knew it wasn't necessary. His words were empty, and his actions couldn't undo what had happened. And they left, like the last guests whose memories quickly fade into the fog. The next day, when the sun was setting again, Dad tried calling from a new number. He begged me, addressing me by name, as if I could forget everything that had happened. But I didn't answer. I had already made my decision. Some bridges, once burned, should remain ash. I wasn't going back. That was 2 months ago. Now I live in my mother's house, my home. I've repainted the walls, planted new roses in the garden, and made it mine again. It's my space, my corner of the world that I can finally call my own. Everything that once belonged to others is now mine. And I feel the peace I hadn't felt since my mother passed. Sometimes I think about them, wonder where they are now, but it no longer matters. I know their life will continue on its own terms, and mine is different now. My work is going well, I've made new friends, and for the first time, I feel like I can breathe, like this house has truly become my home. Sometimes I think of Mom and how she made sure I always had a home, despite all my father's attempts. Sometimes I dial the number they tried to call me from, but I don't answer. And that, too, is part of my healing. Letting go of people, letting go of the lies, and everything that once seemed important but turned out to be just an illusion. Healing means letting go. Letting go of people, letting go of lies, letting go of the fairy tale of family I once believed in. It was hard, but now I am free.